My name is Melissa Begg, and it's my great honor to serve as Dean of the Columbia School of Social Work. It's my pleasure to welcome you today to the Dean's Lecture Series on Inequality and Opportunity. And this series features prominent scholars who address the complex system of racist and oppressive systems that result in inequities, including a focus on disparities in health, education, economic opportunity, and as we'll learn today, energy insecurity. And we're thrilled to have as the next speaker in the series, final for the year, Dr. Diana Hernández, and my former colleague back in the day at the Mailman School. So it's especially nice for me to welcome you here today, Diana. Dr. Hernández conducts research at the intersection of energy, equity, housing, and health. Sociologist by training, her work examines the social and environmental determinants of health and interrogates the impacts of policy and place-based interventions on the health and well-being of socioeconomically disadvantaged populations. Now, much of her community-oriented research has been done in collaboration with community groups and government agencies around the country, including in the South Bronx, where she has also led small-scale housing redevelopment projects. Dr. Hernández teaches graduate level courses on qualitative research methods, design and analysis, public health leadership, and energy justice, which I know is a topic that resonates a lot here at Social Work too. She is co-director of the Energy Opportunity Lab at the Center for Global Energy Policy, which is right in the corner of our own Social Work building here. And she's deputy director of the Center for Environmental Health and Justice in Northern Manhattan. She serves also on New York City's Environmental Justice Advisory Board. And her first book about energy insecurity is due to be released sometime this year, very soon, I think, fall. Yeah, okay, sometime this year, which is excellent. Congratulations. So it's a pleasure to welcome you and hear your presentation today. Thanks.
I just wanted to recognize Dr. Begg because when I was really early in my academic career, I benefited from the Pride program. I think I was in the first cohort and I did CSRI, and I feel like it was boot camp for sociologists that didn't know much about NIH grants and the like. And I think my career since then has really benefited from that foundational work. So thank you. So I'm here to talk about energy, and I know it's a topic that affects us. We are encompassed by and affected by energy in all that we do. And yet from a public health perspective, from a social science perspective, from a justice perspective, seldom are we actually thinking about the implications of energy in our everyday life. And so today I hope to kind of give a lens into how we might start to do that through this work that Jane has seen evolve over the years. I don't think I've ever given a full-length talk at Social Work. And so here it goes. So the title of the book is actually Powerless: The People's Struggle for Energy in America, although the title of the talk is focused on energy insecurity. So I'm going to do this in three parts. First, I'm going to talk about myself and how my work is personal. And in some ways it connects to your anecdote, but I'll give a longer form version of that. And then I'll talk about energy insecurity in America and what are the kind of policy and practical implications. I realize that this work is a bit depressing to some extent. And so not only am I working on humanizing it, but also hoping that people are equipped with ideas about solutions. So I like to tell my story through the lens of housing. And that's important to me because in many ways, my life is basically marked by housing as a platform for opportunity. So this is me as a Head Start, I guess, graduate. And I grew up in the South Bronx, obviously here in New York City, in what continues to be one of the poorest congressional districts in the US. And in fact, the fact that I am a tenured professor at Columbia is a testament to Amazing Grace. Jonathan Kozol wrote a book in 1995, and this was me as a fourth grader, having lived in Section 8 housing, but my grandmother also lived in the Diego Beekman houses where Jonathan Kozol's book was set. And that book was very much about this kind of journalistic account of the lives of me and my neighbors, essentially, at a time when I was a child and at a time when the situation seemed really desperate. And like there were so many cumulative burdens affecting me, my generation, and the environment in which I was growing up. And somehow, kind of by grace, I ended up, my mom ended up buying a home in the Bronx. And that was really the beginning of, between that and her essentially, getting an undergraduate degree while we were still kids, opened up the possibilities for upward social mobility for me and my siblings. I went to Hunter College as an undergrad, and I benefited from the National Institute of Mental Health, one of their kind of career opportunities in research programs, which set me up to be on the PhD track. So Brooke West and I actually met. We were part of the first cohort we were in the same cohort in sociology at Cornell back in 2002. And I actually owned this little apartment complex here in the kind of green, just like shrubbery and trees. And that was the first place that I owned something of my own. I was 19 when I started my PhD, but there was such a juxtaposition between growing up in the Bronx and then ultimately landing in upstate New York, and really straddling inequality in very different ways. Right, I had gone to public school my entire life, and then I was like in the Ivy League and having to make all kinds of adjustments in making that shift. And then I was about to quit my PhD program until one of my advisors was like, oh, you should do this project. I would do it, but I don't have the time. And that was to evaluate the medical legal partnership program based out of the Boston Medical Center. And I really took the opportunity as kind of an open, call to understand what was going on programmatically. But also it just opened up the opportunity for me to really interrogate the issue of housing. And so I led this Dorchester Housing and Neighborhood Study. I embedded myself in the community in Dorchester, which is in the Boston area. And the lawyers were mostly, so this was a program that was providing legal services within clinical settings to address the kind of social determinants of health. And the primary concern was housing among Dorchester residents. And so I did this kind of layered approach where I compared people that were living seeking services at community health centers in Boston, half of them linked to the program and half of them not linked to the program. And then I was doing home-based interviews. And it was actually in this project, so sometimes I use this slide to talk about how sometimes you take these kind of deviant paths. And for me, that was coming back to New York City after experiencing a suicide in my family, and realizing I wanted to just be back home. And that ultimately kind of put me on path to do work on HIV disparities. That wasn't really like my calling, but it became a way to get into public health. And I actually am so grateful for that circuitous route to public health. But it was actually in this, in the Dorchester Housing and Neighborhood Study that I sat in people's homes and I heard from them about what they were experiencing in terms of their housing issues, but also it allowed me to see firsthand what else was going on. And some of that actually was about people having all kinds of contraptions and extension cords from one room to another, and having very poor lighting, being in homes that were uncomfortable in terms of the temperature. And that was what really kind of started to open up not just the observation of it, but also the explanation that people were sharing about this experience that opened up this kind of area for me, in part because it just didn't really exist in the literature at the time. There were a lot of other kind of, there were other discussions on housing and health happening in the literature, but none of it really about household energy. So these are kind of the academic interests that I have. And it's really about housing, energy equity and health, E2H2, as I like to call it, and entrepreneurship as well. And this is how I like to kind of present my wheelhouse. So this is, the kind of various interventions that I've had the privilege to evaluate over the course of my career and or otherwise be involved in. So I really see my kind of research focus as examining housing-based interventions for health, life chances, and the environment. And this is what I kind of see as like the trajectory of the work. Not as important. I think what is important and what I learned initially from that project and what I've gone on to do as a practitioner is to understand the nuances of housing and really kind of understand it as complex. And there too, the research has been kind of limited so that you have some people looking at affordability or some people looking at residential stability. But in fact, what I've done is to create this kind of conceptual model of housing as having 4 pillars: cost, conditions, consistency, and context. And that is actually what helps people, or what is a kind of an organizing way to understand some of the tensions between that affect health ultimately when it comes to housing. And then as a practitioner, I have rehabbed buildings. So my understanding of the built environment and housing not only comes from the work that I have done in terms of research, but also because I've literally like rolled up my sleeves and I understand what it is to bring a building down to like the studs and rebuild it and, put in triple pane windows and, high quality insulation and solar on the rooftops. And so that also has helped me to understand what are some of the kind of real limitations or the tensions in decision making when it comes to what's necessary to intervene. And one kind of proud moment in my career recently is that this work was cited by the Biden administration in their recent Housing Bill of Rights. And so, to me, that's just kind of one example of the kind of impact that I'd like the work to have. So let's talk about energy. I talked about housing, and I fundamentally see myself as a housing researcher. And that's important because a lot of what my understanding of energy is really about household energy. There are many people that think about energy in terms of the sources of it, the siting of it, but my work is really located in housing, and that's why I kind of ventured to give the bigger story, because I want to just bring you back now into where this hidden hardship exists. So you may recall that last year in January, there was this fire that hit the Bronx. It was one of the deadliest fires in New York City in decades. And if you read the newspaper articles, you would take away that the biggest issue was that of the doors that didn't close properly. But if you just took a step back and realized why the fire occurred in the first place, is because there was a space heater that was on incessantly for days on end until it eventually caught fire. And that became the impetus for me to write in an op-ed in the New York Daily News that talks about kind of situating that one experience, tragic as it is, in a legacy of underinvestment in housing and in the fact that many Bronx residents actually experience no heat complaints, more so than in any other borough in New York City. And every once in a while, the situation kind of rises to the level of making headlines, but many people actually experience this behind closed doors. within the privacy of their homes. And for that reason, it is much less understood as a problem, because there's a way in which people not only are navigating it, but are also able essentially to hide it, because there's also kind of shame associated with this, as I'll show. So my work has built up this concept of energy insecurity, first by defining it and then operationalizing it. So I've defined it as the inability to adequately meet basic household energy needs. And there are three dimensions to energy insecurity. There's an economic dimension, which is reflective of high bills relative to low income. There's a physical dimension to this, which is about inefficiencies in the home environment, faulty home energy infrastructure and appliances, and a behavioral component, which is really about the coping and adaptive strategies, the agency, if you will, that people express as they're managing these economic and physical hardships. It also takes two forms. So as was discussed prior to starting, there are acute forms of energy insecurity that are actually population-wide. And that is about power outages, it's about appliance breakdowns or fuel shortages. So really manifestations of really a changing in a climate. So when we think about climate change and the idea that this past weekend, we know when it rains, it pours, right? Like there's no such thing as kind of just a regular rainfall anymore. It's just very intense. And that intensity is also about wildfires and extreme heat, and all of those things actually contribute either to the access of energy, so wildfires compromising access to energy, or extreme heat as in like requiring more, so impacting demand. And then there are chronic forms of energy insecurity, which really are about ongoing financial hardships or the experience of these kind of inefficient and poorly operating appliances. And sometimes if you experience a chronic form of energy insecurity enough, you'll also experience another form of acute energy insecurity, which are disconnections. And disconnections really flow from non-payment. And it's a kind of a growing approach that utilities use in order to capture their essentially recover costs. So what seems like forever now, and in part that's because, I don't know, like of the pandemic and other things, but I did this study, it's a national study, really the first of its kind, to bring together qualitative work that meant that I traveled around the US, quantitative work where that qualitative work essentially informed the development of an original survey, and then also using secondary data sources, including the residential energy consumption survey, which is administered every 4 to 5 years. It really is kind of the best data source for household energy indicators. So initially it was set up to evaluate the low-income home energy assistance program and households in the US that are eligible for LIHEAP. But in 2015, it kind of opened up to everyone in the population. So all of the survey respondents were given a series of questions that we then use to basically talk about the prevalence of energy insecurity in the US. And so these are the places where I kind of spent time. So California, Montana, Michigan, Arizona, Texas, Tennessee, Alabama, Puerto Rico, Pennsylvania, and New York. I went to energy assistance offices, so attached to community action agencies, which are essentially like a network, a national network of social service providers that provide applications for LIHEAP. I also went to connected with participants through advocacy networks, legal services, a food pantry, and a disaster relief organization. So really kind of a comprehensive undertaking of, trying to get a sense of what's the national experience. My work had mostly been either in Massachusetts or in New York, some in Arizona, but I wanted to kind of give a better lens on this. I ended up interviewing 100 participants, 103, if you include a few dyadic interviews that I conducted. All of them were at or below the federal poverty level. Most of them were women. Most of them were Black and Latino. And many had children in their homes. And it was kind of split between owners and renters, with some people also benefiting from Section 8. In the end, I had over 2,000 pages of transcripts and interview notes and research memos and documents. And I analyzed them in two ways. First was kind of a content and thematic analysis, just to understand what was there. And then ultimately, what I thought would be more impactful was a narrative approach. And so I restoried people's accounts based on what they explained to me, to talk about these issues in more of a chronological way, as is done in narrative work. So I'll start with the story of Aisha, who's a 35-year-old mother of 5. She was unable to work because she had a sudden back injury that was work-related. She'd also experienced the sudden loss of her mother, who was an important financial supporter as well as an emotional supporter. And when I met her at the Energy Assistance Office in Tennessee, she explained the many ways in which she experienced energy insecurity. And at the time, she was facing a shutoff. And that's what really kind of was the impetus for her to get to the office early, to make sure to beat the others on the line, because otherwise her utilities were to be shut off. But it was this quote that made the tensions between meeting basic needs that much more clear. She says, "One of my sons had holes in his shoes. I know he needed shoes. I had to look at my money and be like, okay, I got this for the light bill. I know if I don't pay the light bill, then we ain't gonna have no lights. I have done it before. I have let my child go without where he had holes, and I had to patch it up. We had to do what we had to do until I had to get some more money because I had to pay the light bill. It's sad that my kids have had to live with no heat, no cooling, or in the dark during that shutoff." And it was because she had experienced a shutoff for over a week that she felt the urgency to go and seek whatever help was necessary or where she could find it, because she was doing everything she could to prevent that experience yet again. So these are the ways in which people are experiencing energy insecurity in the US. And here I share the data. This work is done with Jennifer Laird, who actually I met because of CPRC and the postdoc program. And we've gone on to publish a few papers together and are also collaborators on the book project. And we basically show that about 12% of households in the US have no AC. Another almost 5% have broken AC. 3% have broken heat. 20%, over 20% have an inadequate insulation, and almost 13% are reporting drafts. 10% are reporting disconnection notices. And mind you, this was actually happening, this latest round of data collection was happening during the pandemic when shutoff moratoria were in effect. So in many states, not in all states, but in our previous work, using the 2015 data, we actually found that it was 15% of households that were receiving disconnection notices. Almost 20% are reporting reducing or foregoing basic necessities, And that's really what Aishas Story kind of represents, right? People that are kind of having to make the trade-offs between food, medicine, heating or treating, or buying their children shoes in order to pay their energy bills. Also keeping the home at an unhealthy temperature. Almost 10% of households are doing that. Only 5% are actually receiving energy assistance. Almost 18% have experienced a power outage lasting more than 24 hours, just under 2%. This year, we're experiencing disconnections. In our previous work, it was 3%, but it is actually millions of households, as I'll show in the next slide. And then other people are keeping their homes. There's extreme temperatures inside the home reported, as well as medical attention sought. When you look at it in terms of numbers, then you realize that millions of households combined are actually experiencing some form of energy insecurity. And what the qualitative work has shown me is that essentially there are ways to think about this and reduce it to its essential elements. So this is an attempt to kind of give some parameters for knowing whether or not you're experiencing energy insecurity, or how people you might be serving and working with or connecting with are experiencing energy insecurity. And so that really falls in several buckets: difficulty paying, debt, the disrepair of homes, drafts, discomfort, thermal discomfort, a disruption of service that has more to do with outages, a disconnection, which is more about the being literally shut off by the utility service. And then this idea of drain. So I've struggled over the years to try and kind of think about a parallel of energy insecurity to food insecurity. And fundamentally, when we think about food insecurity, the kind of feeling that's attached to that is hunger, right? And in hunger, we understand to be more universal. It can be, like as human beings, that we understand what that feels like, but we can also sympathize and empathize with people who are experiencing a hunger for extended periods of time. And when I think about the experience of energy insecurity and what I've learned from participants, what I have experienced in my own life, is that there's a draining effect to energy insecurity. It's financially draining, it's mentally draining, it's physically draining, that there's a way in which like your personal energy as a human being is like basically being taken as a result of having to manage discomfort and feeling like you have no other option other than to stay in bed to keep warm, or to really sweat it out and, just be like desperate for cooling, for instance, when it's too hot. That there's a way in which when you're thinking about whether or not you can afford this bill, there's like that draining effect that keeps you up at night, right? So kind of this draining is an attempt to capture what the actual like feeling of energy insecurity encompasses. And when we put those essential elements within kind of a larger framework of what's actually happening at the macro level, at the micro level, what kind of these external triggers look like, and all of the coping that it takes to prevent and or to respond to energy insecurity. And then ultimately kind of it leads to adversities and indignities, adversities having to do with health, social and economic impacts, and the indignities of disrespect coming from so many sources, from your landlord to the utility companies, and to the feeling, and to like even energy assistance services when people are turned away. So part of the work is also about understanding not just the essence of energy insecurity, but where it sits in these larger kind of social phenomena, and kind of where it lands people in terms of health. So in the book, we kind of discuss legacies of redlining and disinvestment in housing, and how that is kind of sits within that structural, environmental, market-based risk factor bucket, inequalities in wealth, and what that ultimately has where that lands people in terms of their abilities to afford things, and how this is a really dynamic process, right? So that these macro forces are creating pathways for individuals to then experience these issues. All right, so I'm going in and out, and I hope you don't mind. They are now in my world. The book is kind of organized in a few parts, where we talk a little bit about this is the setup. So I just kind of set it up, and now I'm going to talk about the kind of core components, this kind of economic, physical, and coping, and then get into energy assistance. This is just a breakdown of kind of where people's bills have been, electricity prices, consumptions, and bills in the 10-year period between 2011 and 2021. And what you could see is that basically the bills are increasing. Consumption is decreasing in some ways because of increases in energy efficiency. So appliances are much more energy efficient. There's kind of a push around improving the energy performance of buildings from kind of new construction perspective, but also in terms of retrofitting older kind of homes and buildings. But ultimately, the prices of energy have also gone up, and they continue to rise. In fact, and when we look at what this looks like at the national level, what you see is that people in the South are kind of very kind of energy burdened, meaning that they're facing higher energy bills, especially electricity bills. So this is Blanche. I met her in Greene County, Alabama, and I have to say that many of the interviews are memorable, but hers especially. I walked into her home, and I sat in the biggest room I've ever sat in a home ever, right? Especially coming from New York City, where everything is kind of compact. I sat in a room that actually looked a little bit like this. It had maybe 15 different seats where you could sit, but there were several fans, kind of in an effort to stave the heat. This Blanche, she had been living in this home for over 30 years. And what she really kind of talked about was the fact that she didn't understand why her bill was so high. She's like, my bill has never been this high. I just don't understand why. I've never had a bill like this in the 45 years we've owned this house. They just charge me too much for light. It's not that I don't know what I'm doing. It's not that I'm just using them things. It's that I'm very particular about everything that I do, and I still can't keep up. She turned off her water heater. There was nothing plugged into the outlets that didn't need to be plugged in. She was taking every step she could, including having weatherized her home in order to manage her bills, and she still couldn't keep up. Then she tried to write her story, and she wrote this letter, and she said, I just need to write to Black Warrior and tell them, this is the utility service provider, that I can't keep up with the bill. But her story was a bit incomplete. And it was incomplete in part because she hadn't gone to school. She's not a high school graduate. And as she kind of was trying to tell her story, there were parts of it that she was able to write out. And then there were parts of it that were in blank. And that, to me, I think is a lot of what's going on in terms of the story of energy. But when it comes to thinking about debt, so as people are trying to manage, when they can't manage, it often materializes into balances that are unpaid. And what we found when we looked at this from the E2H2 survey, which is the original survey that flows from the insights from the qualitative work, we found that many people are carrying debt. And that debt kind of varies, not so much in terms of electricity and gas, where many people have some debt, most of it under $500, but in these kind of, let's say, less conventional, dirtier fuel sources like fuel oil and wood, people are actually carrying more debt when they're carrying debt. So something kind of closer to between $500 and $1,000. So this is an area we don't know enough about because the utility companies have this information but don't report it to the public. And so it's surveys like this that kind of help to shape that, but we don't otherwise, like Rex, for instance, doesn't collect this information about debt. So this is a story that was actually on the news. We don't have time to actually go through it. But Edith, who I met in Detroit, watched the story, and it was like a meta experience. So she was in her home, and basically she was living in an inherited home in Detroit. So when we think about housing expenses, the cheapest form of housing is housing that has no overhead. And that's true in inherited property. So by that standard, like her main responsibility were the property taxes. And she was still unable to live in this home adequately, in part because she was experiencing this kind of cascading effect of problems. So first, it was that the heat went out. The boiler that kind of was aged and had aged with the house basically finally gave up. She was only using her stove for heat. Then there was a gas leak. The utility company came and shut off the gas because of the gas leak and the safety hazard that it presented. And then she was only left with a kerosene heater in her bedroom and the microwave and other electric sources to prepare food and then to store it. And so all of a sudden, her life went from this rather large house to her room, and even smaller than that, like rushing over to the cold bathroom to kind of clean up and then go into her car so that she could finally be encompassed by heat. And this was kind of, in some ways, a unique experience, but it's also one of those experiences where you see how like kind of the spiraling effect of one situation can cause people to be pretty desperate. So these are some of the indicators of physical energy insecurity, some of them that I'd already reported. But what's the real takeaway here is that a lot of these are very consistent. So when you look at them over time, you still see a pretty, kind of similar number of households that are impacted by inadequate heat, by drafts, by no AC, by no heat, by broken AC and broken heat, even as there have been kind of policies, especially more recently, to essentially kind of try and shift that. And when you look at the kind of breakdown of homes that are disproportionately impacted by physical energy insecurity, you see that it's very low income groups, that Hispanics and Blacks are more likely to experience this physical energy insecurity, that folks with less than a high school education are more likely, that households with children are more likely, the elderly are spared, and that I think is a good question to get to for Q&A potentially. That people living in apartment buildings, either smaller buildings, 2 to 4 family or mobile homes are more likely, those relying on natural gas, and ironically enough, solar, but we can kind of talk about what that might mean, also in the Q&A. People living in older homes, renters, urban dwellers, and people living in the West are also more likely to be experiencing some of these physical challenges. All right, I'm gonna go quicker. So this is Sophia. I met her in the Bronx. And basically, she had 2 words for me. She said, "I suffer," when she had to explain the kind of thermal discomfort that she experienced in her home because she couldn't afford to put as much kind of oil in the oil tank and re-up it as needed. And so when we look at the kind of coping strategies that people are kind of enacting as a result of the kind of physical, economic, and or combined experiences with energy insecurity, what you see is that as people are experiencing either no measurable coping or I guess it doesn't matter so no measurable coping or physical only. So if they're not experiencing physical or economic, if they're only experiencing physical or economic only, you see that the kind of many people are just not doing anything. But as the risk increases, especially as they're likely to experience economic challenges and or economic challenges in combination with physical challenges, then many more of them are actually foregoing necessities or foregoing and combining that with either receiving energy assistance or keeping their homes at an unhealthy temperature. And by the time they're experiencing physical and economic challenges, many more are doing all three. So there's like high effort coping that's happening. So what are the policy and practical implications of this? So this is another woman that I met in the Bronx. She's a cancer survivor. And basically she says, like, my health doesn't allow me to essentially have the home at an unhealthy temperature. I just can't stand the cold. And when the cold hits, that's when my bill kind of goes out of control and I can't afford it. But the interesting thing about energy assistance in the US is that, first of all, it's crisis oriented and it's seasonally driven. It was initially kind of conceived of as heating assistance, and that really comes from the 1970s and 80s when there was this kind of oil crisis in the US. Most of that was around heating fuels, and the program has maintained that kind of status even over time as we've kind of been experiencing extreme heat, for instance, as well. And so what you see is that this is New York State, the low-income home energy assistance budget allocations. Most of it is around heating. The other kind of major element is around crisis. Far few are, kind of from a proportional perspective, cooling and weatherization are much smaller kind of elements of the program. So as we think about why people aren't enrolling, so nationally, something like 15% of all eligible households are actually receiving light heat benefits. That's because of limited awareness, confusion about eligibility restrictions, some of it also kind of seasonal, administrative burdens, the kind of benefit restrictions, and then cold weather bias. These are some kind of recommendations to improve the situation. Some of it about kind of funding and more effective outreach and enrollment for the programs. Fixing the light heat formula at this point, if you remember where the bills are highest, it's in the South. But if I were to show a map of where light heat how light heat is budgeted at the federal level, you'll see that those are also the states that have the least support. So really there's this kind of policy mismatch between where the need is and where the funding is going. Are there opportunities for automatic enrollment? Not conditioning energy assistance on the receipt of disconnection notices, essentially kind of almost encouraging households to get to a crisis point before they're actually able to seek services. And then kind of other ideas around balance billing and thinking about revisiting weatherization programs, limitations around investments. But I think there's also an opportunity to be thinking about energy as a right. And if we were to do that, then we would be thinking about, so energy is a basis for the right to health. It is the basis for the right to housing. Without energy, those rights can't actually be realized. And so if we think about the right to energy, that would look like healthy, sustainable energy production, the right to the best available energy infrastructure, the right to affordable energy, and the right to uninterrupted energy services. So that would actually mean that there's an investment in green energy, like from the production side, and green buildings and in green jobs. I started thinking about housing, but the solutions when it comes to energy have a lot to do with housing investments. And I can't go into all of this because I'm kind of running out of time. But we're also in this really kind of interesting moment from an energy perspective. We are in a once in a generation transition right now. And when we look at the numbers in terms of who has access to rooftop solar, for instance, it is absolutely not people of color and low income groups. And that is, if we're really thinking about energy security, if we're thinking about energy as a right, then that absolutely must kind of shift. Community solar is an opportunity for people to participate in the clean energy economy. But there are a lot of restrictions, including people having debt worthiness. And sometimes that becomes kind of a way in which, or a barrier to accessing community solar. The right to affordable energy, there are actually programs that are managed by the Federal Communications Commission on broadband and on phones. We have Obama phones, but we don't have an equivalent when it comes to energy. There are also programs based on percent of income. So one of the interesting things about energy is that everybody pays the same rate. Whether or not I'm a multimillionaire and someone else is earning less than $5,000 a year, our kilowatts all cost the same. And that is such a different kind of model compared to other commodities that we now know. And that became really obvious even during the pandemic. There's also the possibility of eliminating disconnections. Disconnections are a business practice, but there are some utilities, including the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, that have decided to eliminate disconnections for people that can't pay. So that is a decision. We saw that actually unfold during the COVID pandemic as well. So there is the possibility, but I think ultimately what that comes down to is the answer to a moral question. And that moral question is, are we as a society one that accepts that there are some people that could live without energy some of the time because we have equal rates that many people can't fundamentally afford. And I'm going to leave it there. I think one of the pieces to the puzzle that's really important is the idea of community engagement. We really, have to incorporate the voices of people that are affected and people that are closest to the issues because they understand it. And that I think requires people that are in positions to serve and assist to do so with humility and with a lot of these kind of principles that are listed out here. And so with that, not a lot of time for Q&A, but I wanted to get through it all. Thank you.
Glad we have a few minutes for Q&A, and thank you for an excellent presentation.
Thank you.
I think new to a lot of us, right? This particular aspect of well-being, right? Because we're in school social work and we're all about maximizing human well-being, ensuring everybody has opportunity. And you're pointing out this huge aspect of housing and quality of life and well-being and health-related effects that I think is really important, that is new to me anyway, and I think really essential. So thank you. I can start with questions, or we can start by asking folks in the room if they have any questions they would like to pose. Yes, Dr. Elbasal.
Thank you so much. I really learned a lot from your presentation. I truly appreciate it. I wonder, when you travel to collect your data from all the different states, the energy assistance is the same across all the states? I know I was in Houston recently, and they don't have access to it. They don't have the benefit even of getting it. So I wonder if you can speak about this. And the other part of my presentation, I like what you said, the phone, Obama phone, which we use it in our studies. what is your vision about, like, what model would be similar to Obama's phone?
Mhm.
As you can.
Yeah, two very thoughtful questions. So Texas actually does have low-income home energy assistance program benefits. So that program is distributed at the federal level as block grants to states. But the formula itself actually privileges cold weather states like in the Northeast, in the Midwest, and less so because, again, the idea of it is that it's not just about like affordability in general, it's that it's affordability for heating purposes. And that's also how it's structured in New York City. You cannot benefit from LIHEAP in New York City if your heating is included in the rent. And the cooling kind of component of the program would only provide an actual air conditioner, no bill subsidy. So part of the problem is that there's really not a universal way in which states are mandated to allocate the resources. They're given a budget and they can decide what proportion of it is going to bill assistance, what are the parameters in terms of the season, right? We don't think about food, so we don't think about SNAP seasonally. We understand that this is a monthly need that people need every day, and that's true for energy, but the way that it's organized is very, very differently. It's just like, you can only figure it out if you're cold, but everybody else is like in a problem. When I think about what the right to energy looks like and what that kind of either lifeline or kind of, government sponsored or public power option looks like, is that there's an allocation of kilowatts per month. And we can calculate that. We know how many kilowatts, either by an actual household, and that may vary if they are requiring a medical device, for instance, right? Because we're not even thinking about those folks that are needing nebulizers or oxygen concentrators or whatever. So we can kind of think about and accommodate, or we could just say, like, in the same ways that there's a formula for SNAP, if you're a household of one and you can get this much per month. But I think that there needs to be some kind of equivalent for energy, and right now there's nothing.
Oh, Jane.
No, that's such a great idea. I have so many questions. I'll just ask one. I'm just curious, when you're talking with folks in communities, how much overlap are you seeing between the issues that you're looking at and other issues around environmental justice or climate justice? So it occurs to me that, a lot of the burdens that you're talking about are concentrated in low-income communities, that low-income housing is disproportionately heated by the most expensive sources of heat or has the oldest appliances, that would be in parallel with issues around lack of access to clean water or living in communities that are very polluted or have bus depots. And I just wonder, when you're talking with people in communities, how much are they seeing these issues as being related and how much are they separate?
Well, there's a recent bill that was passed in New York State, really driven by We Act for Environmental Justice, their efforts to talk about cumulative burdens. And that has been a real kind of, that's been a newer area in environmental justice, but certainly the recognition that many of the communities that are dealing with water sanitation issues are also dealing with unaffordable energy, are also living in a food apartheid, are also, right? And the challenges are cumulative and they're chronic. And I think from a justice perspective, there's certainly the kind of vision to start to say, like, we need to have the resources. And I think one of the other pieces, because again, we're in this unique moment, right? The Inflation Reduction Act, Justice 40, there were many kind of pots of funding essentially that opened up very recently during the Biden administration, some of it connected to the pandemic, that is now actually kind of putting resources and decision-making kind of authority in communities' hands. And I think that has also been an opportunity to be, while energy affordability isn't necessarily top of the political agenda, it is definitely top of mind for many households, and it has risen as an issue for people that are seeking justice, for sure.
Thank you. Yes, go ahead.
Hey, I just wanted to say, I think the research that you're doing on this is incredibly important. I'm from the South and was it from North Carolina? And I've witnessed a lot of energy insecurity within my community. Like there are still people in my state, like they live in buildings that have like dirt floors, for example, and they experience this kind of stuff. I wanted to ask specifically about the shutoffs, like the eliminating disconnections. Would you say that's more of a local issue, like petitioning the town utility company, or would you say that's like a state issue? Like if we as social workers, if we wanted to make a difference in that area, what's the best way that we can advocate for ourselves and advocate for our clients?
Public Utility Commission, every state has one. They are the ones that regulate and oversee a lot of, the utility services. But in the South, you also have rural electric co-ops, and those are kind of much more localized. It's a governance structure that's based on member owners. And in that way, there's a lot of potential for democratizing energy, but that would be a little bit more of a local approach. What could happen also federally, I think, is that there would be a ban on disconnections at all utilities. Because so there are 3 different utility types, and not to get into like all of the technical pieces of this, but we're here. So there are investor-owned utilities, there are municipal utilities, and there are rural electric co-ops. So the example that I shared of the LA Department of Water and Power is a municipal utility, and sometimes they don't fall under the jurisdiction of the Public Utility Commissions, but most of the investor-owned utilities are charging the highest rates for energy. And so if they were to shift their practices, it would mean a lot more. So you can take like kind of this big approach with states and then think about ways in which that might kind of trickle down to other utility providers.
I think we are just about out of time. There's one more question online, maybe, or not? Yeah. Would you mind receiving email later if there's a question?
Oh, I totally invite. I invite engagement and conversation and collaboration on this. So for sure.
Oh,
thank you for the
great.
opportunity to share my story on this.
No, it's great. You started out by saying this is kind of depressing. And I definitely hear where you're coming from on that. And at the same time, you're pointing to solutions, and that is incredibly hopeful and intentional. And so I just want to lift that up and say thank you for that. And look forward to talking with you more about how we can make those changes, particularly with social workers going out in the world and trying to make, advocating on behalf of their clients and the people they work with. So I want to thank you once again. Thank you, everybody, for joining us online and in the room.